Good day. A few days ago, I did a program on this channel in which I said that summer is the traditional time of military exercises, but that this year the extent and nature of the exercises that are being carried out by the various powers has a radically different character. Indeed, I cannot help but feel that the way exercises are being carried out by the major powers is designed not just to send a message to the other, but also to prepare and drill for an actual war situation. In other words, these exercises have a strikingly different character from exercises that have been carried out in the past, including, I should say, exercises which have taken place which took place during the Cold War. Moreover, a feature of the exercises we see today, the military exercises we see today, is the extent to which they involve increasingly the navies of each of the two great power blocks, as opposed to their ground forces, which suggests that if there is going to be a conflict between the great powers, it will be at sea. So a few weeks ago, back in May and June, we saw big NATO exercises being conducted in the Black Sea under the watchful gaze of the Russian Navy, which, by the way, totally dominates the Black Sea, which is essentially a Russian lake. And we saw the Russians, in turn, hold their own exercises in the Black Sea. Now we are seeing a massive exercise by the US Navy, bringing together navies of allied powers, other powers that are allied to the United States, being conducted in the Pacific. And this exercise is also on an enormous scale, and it too is clearly intended to prepare or drill for an armed confrontation with China. And by the way, that is a new and ominous development, and one which must be sending a shiver of alarm across the entire region. This exercise, of course, is taking place alongside or simultaneously with ground exercises which the Chinese and the Russians are conducting with each other in northern China, which I also discussed in a recent program. Those exercises by the Russians and the Chinese, we now learn, are going to extend to each side, each army, the Russian and the Chinese army, actually using each other's military equipment in order to familiarize themselves with it in a way which shows that the Russians and the Chinese are moving towards interoperability of their armed forces in a way which again is clearly characteristic of military allies, which is what they're becoming. This is new, but I read from Global Times that the Russians are actually going to be, as part of these exercises, using Chinese armoured vehicles and tanks in order to obviously familiarise themselves and to get a better sense of how these exercises, how these weapon systems, these vehicles actually work. And doubtless before very long, the Chinese will be doing the same with Russian equipment. But it is the big exercise, the big US exercise or US-led exercise in the Pacific, which is the one which is attracting the greatest attention. And unsurprisingly and completely predictably, it has been the topic of commentary by the Chinese newspaper Global Times, which, as I repeatedly say, is the English language newspaper owned by the People's Daily, which is the official organ of the Central Committee of the Communist Party of China, and which therefore shows that Global Times is very close to and almost certainly accurately reflects the thoughts and ideas of the Chinese Communist Party and of the Chinese government. And it has much to say about these exercises. It notes that the exercises that the United States is now conducting in the Pacific, in which, by the way, HMS Queen Elizabeth is apparently also playing a part, that these exercises are on a huge scale and that they are intended, in part at least, to intimidate and alarm China and Russia, though Global Times assures us that they're not going to do anything of the sort. And we also learn from Global Times, and here they're quoting actually the US media, that the exercises that are being held in the Pacific are intended to tell the Chinese and the Russians that the United States is fully capable of fighting a war on two fronts, that it is capable of taking on China and Russia simultaneously. And perhaps that's the first point that I'm going to discuss in one article by Global Times, which directly contradicts this particular claim that the United States can take on China and Russia at one and the same time. And this is what the Global Times says. If this is not a drill, but a real battle, it is far from a local war, but a full-scale one. In other words, this is a drill for a full-scale war, not a local war. And then it quotes the Defense Post, which is a US media outlet which specializes in military matters, as saying the following: analysts perceive large-scale exercises 2021, that's the big exercise in the Pacific which I'm discussing, as a message from the United States to Russia and China that it can handle a simultaneous response to aggression on multiple fronts. Well, when it talks about aggression, obviously what the Defense Post is referring to is aggression on multiple fronts by Russia and China. And then this is how Global Times responds. The truth is, the US military may be able to deal with small countries, but even that won't be easy. If it wishes to confront China and Russia simultaneously, the US does not have such a capability. Even if the US barks out loud about these large military exercises, what the North American country really shows is its lack of self-confidence. Even during the Cold War, a drill on the scale of LSE 2021 was not common. Taking place today simply shows how worried the US is with its combat capability to confront countries like China and Russia. US media outlets say this is a return to similar Cold War exercises. This is not precisely a return. US military strategy has always been adhering to the military strategy of World War II and the Cold War, focusing on deterrence. But what the US should really deliberate about is how to handle future wars, modern wars, with countries as strong as China and Russia, where deterrence no longer works. Over the past decades, the US has launched wars against small countries. With its overwhelming advantages in high technology and in the US system, US opponents had a difficult time fighting back. However, if its target turns to China or Russia, the two countries with sound systems, strong combat capabilities, and nuclear weapons, the US has no experience. The ongoing major power game between China and the US is exhausting the US, so it is eager to show some deterrence through such military exercises. But China is not the Soviet Union. China's military capabilities are striding forward with constantly improving comprehensive strength and technological power. The United States will only find it difficult to reach its goals by carrying out such military drills. And then that article, which was analytical, is combined with a long editorial in Global Times, which covers much the same ground, but also has some other interesting things to say. And it reads as follows: but the US wants to awe China and Russia by flexing its military muscles in a miscalculated move. China will hold military exercises from Friday to Tuesday in a vast area in the South China Sea between Hainan and Sisha Islands as a response to the joint Indo-Pacific military exercise. Neither China nor Russia has the intention to compete for command of the seas with the US, but both have the ability and determination to despise US coercion in areas that concern their core interest. With current modern technologies, major powers have enough capability to destroy all targets within certain distances. The US Navy has built a global capability that helps sustain the loyalty of its allies. But if the United States engages in a real war with China and Russia, its naval strength will not be able to survive. For big powers, navies are more a showcase of strength and resolve. A gamble-like test is needed to see their real effect in modern wars. We hope such a test would never come. Well, we go on to read other comments by Global Times. They make comparisons with what might happen, how the US might react if China were to send aircraft carrier strike groups into the Caribbean Sea and such like. But notice certain points that are being made here, that the US Navy cannot realistically hope to take on China or Russia in areas that are in seas and oceans close to the Russian and Chinese coastlines, that the development of new methods of warfare, this specifically clearly refers to the development of hypersonic weapons, means that US Navy warships close to the Chinese and Russian coasts would have only a very short lifetime and would be rapidly destroyed, and that at the same time the Chinese and the Russians do not want and have no plan to challenge US global dominance over the entirety of the world's oceans and seas, but the United States, having developed its navy precisely in order to achieve such dominance, it has developed a navy based heavily around aircraft carriers, which makes it especially vulnerable to Chinese and Russian hypersonic weapons if it approaches the Chinese and Russian coastline. And I would add that perhaps not coincidentally, the Russians have now confirmed that they are developing yet another hypersonic missile, the KH-95, which will be deployed by Russian strategic bombers, and which it will be air-launched from those bombers, and which will presumably supplement the Kinzhal hypersonic missile carried by the MiG-31 fighter bombers, and which is presumably intended, like the Kinzhal and the sea-launched Zircon missile, to strike against US warships. I'm going to make a guess, by the way, that the KH-95 is based on the same kind of scramjet technology that the Zircon uses, different from the rocket technology used by the Kinjal, and that it is in effect a refined version of the Zircon, which will in time supersede the Kinjal, and which will become the major hypersonic air-launched missile system that the Russian Air Force and the Russian Naval Air Force will deploy. Anyway, I digress. So we have all of this going on, but perhaps the most interesting and rather perhaps even alarming comment is the one that the Chinese are making about the fact that the US deterrent strategy doesn't work, and that China and Russia are no longer deterred by US military moves, and that the kind of maneuvers that the US is carrying out in the Pacific are really indications of an obsolete strategy of deterrence which no longer works. Now, I have to say, I find that a rather alarming comment, because though Global Times goes out of its way to stress that China is not looking for a fight with the United States, it shows, or at least it's intended to give the impression, that China is fully prepared for such a fight, and that China's military preparations are not geared towards deterrence of the United States in a conventional war. They are geared to China actually winning such a war on the assumption that such a war, sooner or later, is actually going to take place. The Chinese, as I discussed in another program, which I've recently done, are obviously upgrading their nuclear deterrent force in order to protect themselves from nuclear attack by the United States against the Chinese mainland, but they are actively preparing for a conventional war with hypersonic weapons as the centerpiece to gain control of the oceans and seas around China, the East and South China Seas, and ultimately also Taiwan. And they're preparing all of this with the full intention of waging such a war and winning it. Now, that is different from the kind of philosophies adopted by the Soviet Union and the United States during the Cold War. In the Cold War, the Soviets and the Americans developed their armed forces with no real plan to attack each other, but rather with the plan of deterring the other side from attacking them. The situation, the military strategic situation in Europe during the Cold War, despite occasional moments of tension and fear, such as the Berlin crisis of 1961 and the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962, was basically stable. What the Chinese are talking about is a far more fluid, far more dynamic situation in which China, at least, is actively preparing for a conflict and is considering a future war and is working towards actual wargaming. Now, that is new, and I wonder whether people in the United States have understood that and have internalized it. I suspect that they have not, and that they may think that the Chinese are bluffing. But as I have always said and repeatedly said, assuming that China is bluffing is always wrong, and attempting to counter-bluff China always fails, because sooner or later the bluff is going to be called. And that, it seems to me, is exactly, again, what the Chinese are warning the United States about in this article. Anyway, the other major big takeaway from all of this is the way in which the two great power blocs, which is what they are, let's be straightforward about this, are now actively training together against each other. So we have the Russians and the Chinese training, developing their ground forces, familiarizing each other with the other parties' weapon systems. Russians training using Chinese infantry fighting vehicles and tanks. The Chinese shortly going to be doing the same thing in order to achieve full interoperability of their armed forces. And we see the United States, of course, trying to draw in its allies, including some of its European allies, into naval exercises in the Pacific. It's still not widely accepted or understood, but we are talking about two military blocs as well as two economic and political ones. Now, it didn't have to be this way. We did a recent program on the Duran with the academic and writer Glenn Deason, who's been looking at the whole process of Eurasian integration. It seems to me that the United States has made a major miscalculation. It always assumed that a Russian-Chinese alliance, a military alliance, would never evolve or happen, but with talk about interoperability of Russian and Chinese military equipment, that is what we have. And this is the overarching story, the overwhelming big political story of this summer. It shows that the two major power blocs, now seeing each other as enemies and adversaries, are actively training against each other and are integrating their armed forces, the armed forces of their component parts, in order to fight each other. And note how Global Times, the voice of the Chinese government, feels able to speak for Russia as well. It says, when it says that the Russians are not going to be impressed or deterred by US military moves in places like the Black Sea, Global Times appears to feel that it is able to speak for Russia in that way, and indeed it is in fact echoing much of the commentary that we are hearing the Russians give. After all, it was only a few weeks ago that Putin himself confirmed that Russia would be prepared to bomb a warship like the British warship HMS Defender that came too close to the Russian coast, and that Russia would do that confident that no Third World War would follow. So this is turning out to be a fascinating, remarkable and dangerous summer. A line is being crossed. If you like, the two great power blocs are now starting to visibly coalesce and form. You could almost say that the battle lines are being drawn. Well, I hope it doesn't come to an actual battle, but I think people in Washington need to start paying heed both to what is happening and to what is being said. And on one thing, by the way, I agree with Global Times, and I agree unequivocally. Any idea that the United States might have that it can deter Russia and China simultaneously in Europe and Asia is delusional. And the sooner the United States acknowledges that fact, the better for the United States it would be. For the moment, it can take on either China or Russia, but even that is becoming more difficult. And though the US Navy and the US military perhaps can, for the moment, just about stretch to the point when they can contain, or at least think they can contain, the Chinese and the Russians simultaneously in Asia and Europe, the time frame when the US can still do that is passing fast. Within a few years' time, 2, 3, 5 years at most, that window will be gone. Anyway, I said that the battle lines are being drawn. That's increasingly how it's looking. Let's hope that diplomacy will take the place of rhetoric, that we won't have any more debacles like the disastrous visits of meetings between Blinken and Wendy Sherman with the Chinese at Anchorage and Tianjin, and between Borrell, the EU's High Representative for Foreign Affairs, and Lavrov in Moscow that we've seen this year. But whether, in fact, the Western powers will understand all of this, whether they'll drop their rhetoric and start engaging in some real diplomacy, well, that remains to be seen. But at the moment, the omens are not good. And as I said, it's looking increasingly as if the battle lines are being drawn. Thank you for joining me for this program today. I look forward to you joining me in future programs on this channel. And please don't forget to look up our main channel, the Duran, where I do programs with my colleague and friend, Alex Christoforou. Please also check us out on our other platforms, BitChute, SuperU and Locals. And please, in particular, remember to sign up for Locals, where lots of exciting things are about to happen. Also, please check out our shop. Buy yourself the amazing things you will find there. Our amazing magic mugs, our hats, our hoodies, our sweatshirts, our t-shirts, and all the rest. And please, if you've liked this video, remember to press the like button and also to check your subscription to this channel. Thank you for joining me again today, and I look forward to you joining me again in the future, and have a wonderful day until then.